The shadow in the mirror. Marcus had always had a weakness for antiques. He loved strolling through flea markets and discovering old, forgotten treasures. One day, he stumbled upon a small antique shop on the edge of town that he had never noticed before. The shop was narrow and crammed with old furniture, dusty books, and strange curiosities. It was almost as if time had forgotten this place. As Marcus wandered through the narrow aisles, a mirror caught his eye, half hidden behind an old dresser. The frame of the mirror was carved from dark wood and adorned with intricate, almost hypnotic patterns. He couldn't quite say what fascinated him so much about the mirror, but something within him was immediately drawn to it. "You have a good eye," said the shopkeeper. An old man with a gaunt face and deep wrinkles that made his face resemble a weathered landscape. "This mirror is a true treasure. It dates back to the 19th century and once belonged to a wealthy family who lived in a grand estate. A real rarity." Marcus examined his reflection in the mirror. It seemed odd, almost distorted, but he brushed the thought aside, thinking it was just the dust covering the mirror. "How much does it cost?" he asked finally. The price was surprisingly low. Maybe too low, Marcus thought, but the old man insisted that the mirror would bring him good luck. Without further hesitation, Marcus bought the mirror and had it delivered to his home. When he got home, Marcus placed the mirror in his bedroom. The dark wooden frame perfectly matched the furniture, and he was pleased with his purchase. But the strange occurrences began that very first night. Marcus lay in bed, staring at the dark silhouette of the mirror on the wall. It was almost midnight, and the silence in the house was palpable. Suddenly, he felt as though he was being watched. He sat up and stared into the mirror. There was nothing there, just his own tired face staring back at him. But then he noticed it, a shadow moving behind him. Marcus spun around, but the room was empty. He looked back into the mirror, and the shadow was gone. Had it just been his imagination? A trick of the light? He tried to calm himself, but an uneasy feeling spread through his chest. In the following days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Again and again, Marcus thought he saw movement in the mirror, shadows moving quickly and disappearing the moment he looked directly at them. The air in his bedroom seemed heavy and cold, especially at night. The sense that something was wrong wouldn't leave him. One evening, as he looked at himself in the mirror, the shadow appeared again. This time, however, it was clearer, almost like a figure. Marcus's heart began to race. He couldn't move as the figure in the mirror became more defined. It stood right behind him, a dark, distorted silhouette, without a face, without any recognizable features, just pure darkness. Panic seized him. He spun around, but the room was empty again. When he looked back, the figure had vanished. But Marcus knew he wasn't dreaming. He knew there was something in that mirror, something evil. Marcus couldn't sleep. The eerie occurrences gave him no peace, and the apparition in the mirror haunted him even when he was awake. He began researching the mirror, searching through old books and the internet for clues about its origins. Finally, he came across a story that sent shivers down his spine. The mirror, as it turned out, had once belonged to a wealthy but tragic household. The family who owned it had lived in a large manor near the town, but the family had been wiped out in a gruesome manner. Rumors had it that the master of the house had been driven insane after seeing a dark figure in the mirror, which led him to murder his entire family and eventually take his own life. The mirror had disappeared after the incident and was considered lost for a long time until it somehow ended up in the possession of the antique dealer. The legend claimed that the souls of the murdered family were trapped in the mirror, along with the evil force that had driven the master of the house insane. Marcus could hardly believe what he was reading, but the events of the past few days made it clear that there had to be some truth to the story. He decided to get rid of the mirror, but it was already too late. The following night, Marcus was awakened by a cold draft. The mirror seemed to pulsate in the dark, and as he looked closer, he saw that the figure was there again, this time clearer and more menacing than ever before. The dark silhouette had now taken on a form that was almost human, yet grotesquely distorted, like a shadow that didn't belong to reality. Marcus couldn't move as the figure stepped out of the mirror and glided toward him. It was formless yet terrifyingly real, as if it were made of pure darkness. A horrifying smell of decay and death filled the room, and the being began to murmur in a whispering, incomprehensible language. His heart raced as he tried to leap out of bed, but his body refused to obey him. The figure came closer, its outlines wavering and distorted. Finally, he felt a cold, slimy touch on his skin as the shadow made contact with him. Marcus screamed inwardly, but no sound escaped his lips. He knew he had crossed the boundary between reality and nightmare. He was trapped, not in his room, but in a reflection that no longer belonged to him. When dawn broke, Marcus was found in his bed, his eyes wide open and staring. There were no signs of violence, no traces of an intruder. But something was strange. The mirror was gone. In its place was only a dark, dirty spot on the wall, as if the mirror had never existed. The police could find nothing unusual. To them, it was an inexplicable death, a heart attack, perhaps a seizure. But the few friends and relatives who knew Marcus sensed that something wasn't right. Something dark had claimed him. The house remained empty for a while until a new resident moved in. He also found the stain on the wall strange, but he paid little attention to it. He brought his own furniture, including a large mirror, which he placed in the bedroom. And so, the curse continued. The Whispering in the Woods. Clara loved nature. As a freelance writer, she often sought quiet places where she could escape the hustle and bustle of city life and find inspiration for her stories. This time, she had rented a secluded cabin in a dense, sprawling forest. The pictures on the internet showed an idyllic landscape, far from any civilization, exactly what Clara was looking for. The journey was long and arduous. The last few kilometers had to be traveled on a narrow, bumpy forest road. The trees grew dense and tall, their branches forming an impenetrable canopy over the road. Eventually, she reached the cabin, standing alone amidst the trees. It was old but well-maintained, with a small wooden dock leading to a nearby stream. The forest around her was silent, almost too silent. After carrying her luggage into the house and settling in, Clara decided to take a walk through the woods to explore her surroundings. She followed a small path that wound through the undergrowth. The chirping of birds and the rustling of the wind in the leaves were soothing, and she quickly felt relaxed. But as she ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere changed. The sounds of nature grew quieter, and an unnatural silence fell over the woods. Clara stopped and listened. She could hear nothing but her own breathing and the occasional snapping of twigs under her feet. It was as if the forest had held its breath. And then she heard it, a whisper, so faint and indistinct that she barely noticed it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Clara turned around, but there was no one there. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving her unsettled. Clara returned to the cabin, pushing the strange whispering out of her mind. She chalked it up to her vivid imagination, which occasionally ran wild, especially when she was alone in unfamiliar surroundings. She decided to ignore it and spent the evening working on her new book project. As night fell, she went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. The darkness around the cabin was all-encompassing, and the gentle rustling of the leaves outside seemed to be drawing closer. Clara tossed and turned until she finally drifted off. In the middle of the night, she awoke suddenly. It was as if someone had torn her from her sleep. She held her breath and listened into the darkness. There it was again, the whispering. This time it was clearer, closer. It almost sounded like voices speaking softly to each other, but she couldn't understand the words. Clara sat up in bed and tried to locate the source of the sound. It was coming from outside, from the forest. The whispering was insistent, almost hypnotic, and it seemed to be calling her. She got up, opened the window, and peered into the darkness, but she could see nothing. The voices in the whispering seemed to merge, forming a dark melody of incomprehensible words that sent a cold shiver down her spine. She quickly closed the window and tried to ignore the sound. Eventually, she fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, the whispering was just a faint memory, and Clara tried to reassure herself. Perhaps it was simply the wind blowing through the trees and causing strange noises. She decided to venture into the woods again, this time with her notebook, to find inspiration for her story. But as she ventured deeper into the forest, the uneasy feeling returned. The trees seemed to lean over her, and the wind rustling through the leaves sounded almost like voices. Clara stopped, listened, and again heard the whispering. It wasn't louder than before, but it was more constant, more insistent. She closed her eyes and tried to understand the words, but it remained an inexplicable murmur. Suddenly, she noticed something. The forest was completely silent, except for the whispering. No birdsong, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, nothing. It was as if the forest lived only for these voices. Clara shivered and decided to return to the cabin. But when she turned around, she realized she could no longer recognize the way back. The path she had followed seemed to have vanished. Panic crawled up her spine. She tried to stay calm and walk in the direction from which she had come, but the forest seemed to have changed. Every tree looked the same, and every step led her deeper into confusion. The whispering grew louder, as if it were trying to lure her further into the woods. After hours of aimless wandering, she finally found her way back to the cabin. Exhausted and frightened, she locked all the doors and windows and tried to forget the eerie experience. But the whispering had burned itself into her mind, and she knew it wouldn't stop. In the days that followed, Clara barely left the cabin. The whispering followed her everywhere, during the day, at night, even in her dreams. It was always there, quiet and insistent, as if trying to tell her something. She began to sleep less and less, tormented by the incomprehensible voices echoing in her head. One evening, as the wind howled through the trees and the darkness was impenetrable, Clara decided to follow the whispering. She could no longer ignore it. Armed with a flashlight and a steely determination to understand this eerie presence, she set out into the woods. The whispering guided her, like an invisible hand pulling her into the depths of the forest. The trees grew denser, the shadows deeper, and soon she lost all sense of time and space. The whispering grew louder, clearer, and finally, Clara could understand the words. They were not coherent sentences, but single words that repeated in her mind. "Help us! Come! We're waiting." Finally, she came to a clearing surrounded by old, gnarled trees. In the middle of the clearing stood an old, crumbling well. The whispering seemed to be coming directly from it. Clara approached it hesitantly, peered into the dark shaft, and saw nothing. But the voices were now loud and clear, as if they were rising from the depths of the well to her. "Come to us! Help us! Free us!" The words echoed in her head, and Clara felt an irresistible urge to follow the call. It was as if something dark, something ancient, lurked in that well, something desperately crying out for freedom. Clara stood at the edge of the well, torn between fear and curiosity. The whispering was now almost deafening, and she felt it taking over her thoughts and will. But something inside her resisted the dark temptation. Suddenly, she saw something reflected in the water of the well. It was a movement, a shadow stirring in the depths. Clara recoiled as a bony hand emerged from the water, followed by another. The hands belonged to a shapeless, distorted figure that slowly rose from the water. It was a creature that could have come straight out of nightmares, pale, shriveled, with empty eyes, but full of hatred and despair. Clara backed away, but the creature followed, the whispering now growing into an angry, wailing scream. "Come to us! Free us!" Clara stumbled backward, but her legs felt heavy, as if the forest itself wanted to hold her back. The creature rose fully from the well, a nightmare of bones and shadows, dripping with dark water. Its mouth opened in a silent scream as the hands reached out for Clara. In panic, she turned and ran. But the forest seemed to turn against her, the trees moving as if to prevent her escape. Branches lashed at her, thorns tore at her skin, but she kept running, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispering was all around her, louder and more desperate, as if it was merging with the darkness to overwhelm her. Clara felt her strength fading. But then, just as she thought she couldn't escape, she suddenly broke out of the forest. In front of her lay the cabin, but something had changed. It looked darker, more menacing, and the windows seemed like black holes leading into an endless void. Behind her, she heard the creature approaching, the whispering at her back. She had no choice, so she rushed to the door, flung it open, and closed it behind her, only to find herself in complete darkness. The sounds outside fell silent abruptly, and an eerie, almost tangible stillness prevailed. Clara could hardly breathe. The air in the cabin had become so thick. She groped for the light switch, but when she found it and flipped it, the light remained off. It was as if the darkness had gained its own power, and was turning against her. Then she heard it again, the whispering. This time it wasn't outside in the forest, but inside the cabin, around her, in the walls, in the ceiling, under the floor. It crawled into her mind, settling in her thoughts until she could no longer distinguish between reality and madness. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned around and saw the creature from the well. It stood in the middle of the room, dripping, its empty eyes fixed on Clara. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was even more terrifying. "What are you?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The creature opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the darkness around it began to move as if it were alive. Clara felt her mind beginning to crumble. She could no longer flee, no longer fight. All she felt was an overwhelming fear. Then, without warning, the creature lunged at her. Clara screamed, but it was too late. The darkness consumed her, and the whispering returned, this time in her own mind, quiet, insistent, eternal. The next morning, the cabin was found deserted. No one knew what had happened to Clara. Her car was still parked outside, her belongings were unpacked, and there were no signs of a struggle. But Clara had vanished as if she had simply dissolved into thin air. The police scoured the forest, but they found no trace of her. The only thing that lingered was a sense of unease, a presence that seemed to hover around the area. Some of the searchers reported hearing a faint whisper coming from the depths of the woods, but no one could pinpoint its source. Months passed, and the cabin stood empty. Eventually, the owner sold it to a new occupant who was unaware of Clara's disappearance. After some time, they too began to hear the whisper, which beckoned them deeper and deeper into the forest. The story repeated itself, again and again, an endless cycle. For the forest was alive, and the whisper was not just the wind in the leaves. It was the voice of those who could not escape, trapped in an eternal nightmare that never ended. The door that never stayed closed. Max had always been fascinated by old houses. When he stumbled upon the dilapidated, abandoned estate far outside the city, he couldn't resist. The house had been vacant for decades, and no one in town could remember who the last residents were. The legends surrounding the house only made it more intriguing to Max. It was said that the house was cursed. The villagers barely spoke of it, and when they did, it was only in hushed tones. Stories of strange noises, shadowy figures, and inexplicable events circulated. But Max, a rational man, laughed it off. To him, the estate was an opportunity, a challenge to renovate the house and restore it to its former glory. The purchase of the house went smoothly. The real estate agent seemed relieved to finally get rid of it and offered Max a price he couldn't refuse. Within weeks, Max moved into the old house. Most of his friends thought he was crazy, but he didn't care. He saw the potential in the old walls. No sooner had he moved in than he began exploring the house. It was large, with high ceilings and sprawling rooms, but also dark and decayed. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and mildew, and the light from the setting sun barely penetrated the grimy windows. But the most impressive detail was the large wooden door at the end of the hallway on the ground floor. It was heavy, made of dark oak, and seemed to be the central point of the house. Max tried to open the door, but it was firmly locked. No key could be found, and even force didn't budge it. The door became an obsession for him. What was behind it? Why wouldn't it open? On the first night, Max slept fitfully. He kept hearing strange noises in the house, the creaking of old floorboards, the rattling of windows in the wind, and occasionally a faint, almost inaudible whisper echoing through the halls. But the strangest thing was that several times during the night, he felt as if someone was in the house. Once, he woke up to the sound of footsteps right outside his bedroom. He jumped out of bed and yanked the door open, but there was no one there. The house was steeped in darkness, and only the faint light of the moon shone through the dirty windows. The next morning, Max checked all the doors and windows. Nothing seemed out of place, and there were no signs of a break-in. He attributed the nighttime experiences to his exhaustion and the influence of the unfamiliar surroundings. But on the second night, things got worse. Again, he heard the footsteps, this time louder and closer. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He lay awake in bed, staring at the bedroom door, which was ajar. A cold draft swept through the room, even though all the windows were closed. Then, in the middle of the night, he heard a loud creaking, followed by a dull thud. It came from the hallway. Max jumped out of bed, grabbed his flashlight, and hurried out. The large wooden door at the end of the hall was wide open. Max stood in front of the door, staring into the darkness beyond. Behind it was a narrow, steep staircase leading down to the cellar, which, according to the house plans, should have been bricked up. Max hadn't entered the cellar since moving in, and he was sure the door had been locked before. With his heart pounding, he shone his flashlight down the stairs. It was cold and damp, and the smell of old stone and mold filled his nose. The beam of his flashlight swept over the wet walls and dusty floor, but nothing unusual was visible. He decided not to go further and pulled the door shut again. But as he returned to his bedroom, he heard the door silently and slowly open again. In the days and nights that followed, the scenario repeated itself. Every time Max closed the door, it was open again shortly after. There was no explanation for it. The door seemed to have a life of its own. Max tried to lock it, barricade it, but nothing kept it closed. No matter what he did, the door was always open again. Max began to wonder if the house was indeed cursed. More and more often, he heard the whispers that seemed to come from within the walls. Sometimes, the voices sounded so close that he believed they were right behind him. His sleep grew increasingly restless, and he constantly felt as though he was being watched. One night, as he lay in bed trying to sleep, he heard the door creak again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just the sound of the door, but also a faint shuffling coming from the cellar below. Max stared at the open bedroom door and saw a dark figure slowly shuffling down the hallway, directly towards his room. Max jumped out of bed and ran to the door to close it, but his hand shook so much that he could barely grasp the handle. The figure stopped in the doorway, a shadowy shape disappearing into the hall's darkness. Max couldn't get a clear look at it, but he could clearly sense its presence. "Who are you? What do you want?" he called, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, and Max could feel the cold breath of its presence on his skin. He backed away, reaching for the light switch and praying that the light would work this time. With a click, the light came on, and the figure was gone. The hallway was empty, but the door to the cellar was wide open, and the whispering was louder than ever. Max knew he had to do something to rid himself of this eerie presence, but he had no idea what. The next day, he began researching the house. He spent hours in the local library, sifting through old newspaper archives. Finally, he came across a report that confirmed his worst fears. Over 100 years ago, a wealthy family had lived in the house. But one night, all the family members mysteriously disappeared. The police found no trace of them except for the empty beds and the fact that the large wooden door to the cellar was wide open. It was said that the cellar had originally been built as a refuge during the Civil War, but no one knew exactly what lay within. Max was shaken. The legend said that the souls of the family never found peace and remained trapped in the house, forced to open the doors and lure the next occupant into the cellar. The door that never stayed closed was their portal between worlds. Max was determined to uncover the secret of the cellar. With growing desperation and a mixture of fear and anger, he decided to spend the night in the cellar to get to the bottom of it. He armed himself with a flashlight, a camera, and an old book on exorcisms that he had found in town. As night fell, Max opened the large wooden door and descended the creaking steps into the cellar. Once at the bottom, he sat on the cold stone floor, turned off the flashlight, and waited. The darkness was all-encompassing, and the whispering began almost immediately, this time right around him. He felt the presence again, the cold, oppressive energy that filled the room. The whispering grew into a murmur, then a loud droning, as if countless voices were speaking at once. Max could barely breathe, his fear overwhelming him, but he remained seated, forcing himself to stay calm. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, sputtered, and finally went out, plunging Max into complete darkness. The droning of the whispers paused for a moment, then returned, this time more intense, more piercing, as if the voices were coming from the walls themselves. He couldn't understand the words, but they carried a dark, sinister energy. Max was certain that the ghosts of the missing family were watching him. Panic rose within him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He reached for the camera, hoping to capture something that could serve as evidence later. But when he turned it on, it refused to work as well. Suddenly, he felt a coldness rising from beneath him. It was as if the ground beneath him had come to life, pulsating like a heartbeat. The coldness crawled up his legs, paralyzing him. Then he heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow but relentless, coming straight towards him. Max grabbed the flashlight and repeatedly banged it until it finally flickered back to life. In the beam of light, he saw a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with a face that seemed to be melting, as if it were made of wax. The eyes were hollow. The lips moved silently, as if they were whispering the voices of the ghosts. Max tried to move, but his legs no longer obeyed him. The figure drew closer, the darkness around it pulsing with each step. It reached out a decaying hand and placed it on Max's chest. The moment he felt the touch, an icy coldness shot through him, deep into his core. The whispering now filled his head, droning in his ears, making it impossible to think clearly. The camera slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The figure began to pull him down towards the cellar floor. Max felt himself giving in against his will, as if invisible hands were dragging him down into the stone. With one last effort, Max tried to break free from the figure's grip, but it was futile. He was pulled further down until his body was halfway into the ground. The voices in his head grew louder and louder until they formed a deafening scream. Suddenly, everything fell silent. The figure had disappeared, and Max lay alone in the cold cellar. The darkness was all-encompassing, but the whispering had ceased. An eerie silence prevailed, broken only by Max's frantic breathing. Yet he knew it wasn't over. As he tried to stand, he realized that his legs were still stuck in the ground, as if they had fused with the stone. With a great effort, he pulled himself free and crawled back toward the stairs. He felt as though the cellar itself was turning against him, as if it had come alive and didn't want to let him escape. Suddenly, he felt something under his hand, a ridge, an unevenness in the floor. He shone his light on it and discovered that it was an old book buried in the stone. It looked ancient, the pages yellowed and brittle. With trembling hands, Max opened the book and began to read. It seemed to be some sort of diary, with entries in an archaic script. The last entries spoke of some kind of ritual that had been conducted in this cellar to bind the souls of the dead, and of the danger that arose from opening the door. Max now understood that he had found the final piece of the puzzle. The spirits wanted to tell him something, or perhaps they simply wanted to prevent him from repeating the mistakes of their ancestors. Max fought his way back to the stairs, clutching the old book tightly in his hands. He knew he had to use it somehow to break the curse on the house. He had to reverse the ritual that had bound the spirits to this place. The words in the book were difficult to decipher, but Max kept reading, even though he had to keep going back to the pages because his hands were shaking and his eyes were blurry. Finally, he found the crucial part, a ritual that would release the spirits and seal the door forever. He had to perform it in the room where it had all begun, in the cellar, the center of the evil. Max stood up and positioned himself in the middle of the room, directly over the spot where he had found the book. With a mixture of fear and determination, he began to follow the instructions. He spoke the words aloud, despite the trembling in his voice, despite the feeling that something dark, something evil was lurking in the shadows, watching him. As he performed the ritual, he felt the air around him grow colder. The whispering started again, this time more insistent, as if the spirits themselves were fighting against his efforts. But Max persisted. He completed the ritual, and at the moment he spoke the final words, a crack appeared in the cellar floor. A blinding light burst from the ground, and Max threw his arms protectively over his face. The light grew more intense until it filled the entire room. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. All that was left was total darkness, but the cold was gone, and the whispering had finally ceased. Max woke up the next morning on the cold cellar floor. His body ached, and he felt weak, as if all his energy had been drained. But as he looked around, he noticed that the cellar was no longer the gloomy, oppressive place it had been before. The atmosphere had changed. It was quiet, even peaceful. He slowly stood up, still holding the old book in his hand. The cellar door was still open, But this time it was different. There was no trace of the menacing presence that had previously filled him with fear. Max knew that he had successfully completed the ritual. The spirits were freed, and the curse that had haunted the house was broken. He climbed the stairs back into the daylight. The sun shone brightly through the windows, as if it wanted to dispel the darkness that had hung over the house for so long. For the first time since moving in, the house no longer felt threatening, but like a home. But before he left the property, he took one last look at the large wooden door at the end of the hallway. It was now closed, and would remain so forever. Max took the book with him, the only remnant of that terrible night. He decided to bury it far away to ensure that no one would ever be tempted to uncover the secret of the house again. As he left the house and turned the key in the lock, he knew he would never return. But the memories of what he'd experienced would stay with him forever. And so the door, which never stayed shut, was finally closed, for good. The Faces of Pain. It was one of those invitations you couldn't ignore. When the mysterious message arrived for Daniel, he was immediately intrigued. The invitation came in an old-fashioned handwritten letter on thick yellowed paper. No sender, only a location and time. Villa Orlena, midnight. Discover your true pain. Daniel was no stranger to the macabre. As a journalist specializing in the bizarre and unexplained, he had seen his fair share of strange occurrences. Yet, something about this invitation unsettled him. It wasn't just the strange, almost presumptuous wording, but also the feeling that the sender knew him very well. Nevertheless, his curiosity prevailed, and he set out for Villa Orlena, a property located far outside the city on a remote hill. When he arrived, the villa was shrouded in deep darkness. Only a few of the windows flickered with faint light, and the full moon cast eerie shadows on the weathered facade. The building appeared to have been long abandoned. However, the tall iron gates stood invitingly open, and the path to the entrance was covered by a thin layer of fog. Daniel hesitated for a moment before ascending the steps and knocking on the massive wooden door. The echo of his knock quickly faded, and then silence. No sound, no movement from inside. Just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open by itself. A cold draft brushed past him, and Daniel felt a shiver. He stepped inside and found himself in a large foyer lined with old paintings and dusty furniture. The air was stale, and a faint smell of mold and something unknown lingered. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. He followed the sound deeper into the gloomy interior of the villa. The noise led Daniel to a series of identical heavy wooden doors. Each door was marked with a peculiar symbol that resembled a distorted face. He decided to open the first door, uncertain of what awaited him. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. The room was filled with paintings, countless portraits, each depicting a face frozen in an expression of deep pain and despair. The eyes of the portraits seemed to follow Daniel wherever he went, as if they were watching, judging him. Some faces were grotesquely contorted, as though they had endured unbearable suffering, while others remained in a silent, oppressive sadness. Daniel couldn't tear his gaze away from the paintings. It was as if the portraits not only depicted pain, but projected it directly into his soul. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and he had the unsettling feeling that these faces were more than just artworks. They seemed alive, as if trapped in an eternal moment of suffering. The whispering began softly, barely more than a breath of voices forming in his head. The faces seemed to speak to him, telling him their stories of pain, tales of loss, betrayal, and unfulfilled desire. The voices grew louder, more insistent, pressing into his thoughts until he could no longer endure it and fled the room. But the next room was no different. Here too, portraits lined the walls, but this time it wasn't just faces. Whole bodies were depicted in twisted poses, as if they had been captured in their moments of death. The pain in their eyes was unbearable, and Daniel felt his own fear beginning to rise. He had to brace himself to avoid losing his sanity. As Daniel moved from room to room, it became clear that the villa was more than just an old mansion. It was a prison, a place where the souls of those trapped in these paintings were eternally confined. Each room was another level on the path to hell, each door a portal to a different kind of torment. In one particularly large room, Daniel finally encountered the living. or so he believed. A group of people stood in the middle of the room, enveloped in deep silence. Their faces were ashen, their eyes vacant, as if they were already lost. They seemed not to notice him as he entered the room, remaining motionless even as he stood right in front of them. Daniel spoke to them, but they did not respond. They appeared as shadows of their former selves, as if they had long lost their humanity. On closer inspection, he realized their faces resembled those in the paintings. It was as if the portraits had come to life, or perhaps these people had once been alive and were now trapped in the paintings. The whispering was now a constant murmur in Daniel's mind. The voices of the paintings and the people blending into a chorus of pain. He had to focus to ward off the madness threatening to overwhelm him. But with every step he took further into the villa, he felt his own connection to reality weakening. Finally, Daniel reached the last room. Everything was different here. The room was almost empty, except for a large, high pedestal in the center with a massive canvas standing on it. The painting was not yet completed, showing only the rough outlines of a face, but Daniel immediately recognized what it depicted: his own face. The shock made him freeze. The face was not yet finished, but it already showed the first signs of pain and despair. The lines were rough, almost brutal, as if the artist had worked on it with raw violence. Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Was this his future? Was he to become the next victim of this villa, trapped in a painting depicting his eternal suffering? Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. He turned around and saw a figure cloaked in a long black robe, the face hidden deep in a hood. The figure did not speak, but Daniel could feel the threat emanating from it. It was clear that this was the artist, the one who had created all the suffering faces, and who now wanted to complete Daniel's portrait. "Why?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling with fear. "Why are you doing this?" The figure did not answer. Instead, it slowly raised a hand, holding a brush dripping with dark paint that resembled blood. The artist took a step toward Daniel, and he felt his legs give way. He couldn't escape, couldn't run. He was paralyzed, trapped in the terrifying vision of his own future. The artist now stood directly in front of Daniel. With slow, almost tender movements, the artist brought the brush to Daniel's face. Daniel could feel the cold, wet brush on his skin, tracing over his cheeks and outlining his features, as if the artist was erasing the last traces of his humanity. With every brushstroke, Daniel felt his strength waning. It was as if the artist was drawing his life force into the painting, still incomplete on the pedestal. The pain that had radiated from the pictures was now becoming his own. His face, his body, everything began to change, to distort, as if he was becoming part of the painting. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the darkness around him was overwhelming. The room began to spin. The paintings on the walls became whirlpools of colors and distorted faces. The whispering that had once been only in his head now filled the room, a deafening hum that obliterated every clear thought. In a final act of desperation, Daniel grabbed the brush from the artist's hand. With all the strength he had left, he wrenched it away and pushed the artist back. The figure staggered, but instead of falling, it vanished into a fog of darkness, as if it had never been there. But the damage was already done. Daniel could feel the darkness growing within him, the despair that had been in the eyes of the other trapped souls now within him as well. His body began to dissolve from within, as if being drawn into the painting that depicted his likeness. With trembling hands, he held the brush, now no longer a tool but a weapon that sought to tear away the last remnants of his being. The paint on the brush dripped onto the floor, and where it landed, reality itself seemed to crack, as if the substance of darkness was opening a portal to another realm. Daniel knew he had only one way out. With a desperate cry, he tore the painting from its pedestal and threw it to the ground. But instead of shattering, it vanished in a cloud of ash and smoke, taking with it the last remnants of Daniel's hope. The room around him began to disintegrate, the walls crumbling, and the floor opening beneath his feet. Daniel felt himself falling into an endless void, filled with the voices of those who had been lost in the villa before him. But then, just as he thought it was all over, he felt a hand gripping him, pulling him out of the abyss. He opened his eyes and saw the face of the woman who had rescued him. Her expression was calm, almost peaceful, but her eyes revealed the deep sadness she carried. "You must accept the truth," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Pain is a part of life, and as long as you fear it, it will rule you." With those words, the room, the darkness, the paintings, everything dissolved as if it had only been a dream. Daniel felt solid ground beneath his feet again, and the woman's hand guided him through a door that led to a brilliant light. As he stepped through the door, he knew he had escaped the villa. But deep inside, he also knew that the villa and the faces of pain would never fully let him go. The pain he had seen and felt was now a part of him, but he had learned to accept it. He knew he would carry the memories of that night with him for the rest of his life, but they would no longer control him. And so Daniel set out down the hill, back into the world of the living, determined to tell the story of Villa Orlena and the faces of pain so that no one else would make the same mistake he had. The Forgotten House. When Sophie returned to her old hometown after nearly 2 decades, everything seemed alien. The streets she once knew so well were now overgrown with weeds, and the houses had lost their luster. Yet, she felt an eerie sense of familiarity as she walked through the narrow alleys. It wasn't the town itself that troubled her, but the memories she had long believed were buried here. The next morning, she reached what had truly brought her back. The old house on the outskirts of town, long abandoned and forgotten. Even as a child, Sophie had felt a strange attraction to this building. It had once been a grand villa, but now it stood as a monument to time, its windows blind with dust, its walls overrun with ivy. No one spoke of it, but it was an open secret that something eerie lurked within its walls. Sophie had vowed to solve the mystery of this house that had shaped her childhood. She pushed open the creaking gate and stepped into the overgrown garden. The ground beneath her feet was damp and soft, as if the rain had not ceased here for years. The smell of rot and decay hung heavily in the air. With a slight tremor in her hands, Sophie reached for the rusty doorknob and turned it. The door opened surprisingly easily, as if it had been waiting all this time for someone to return. She stepped inside, and immediately the cold and damp air of the house enveloped her. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, faintly illuminated only by the light filtering through the half-broken windows. The interior of the house was just as she remembered, yet something seemed to have changed. Dust lay thick on the furniture, cobwebs draped like old veils in the corners. She walked further into the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor. An unsettling feeling of being watched overcame her, and she turned around, but no one was in sight. Sophie knew she had to go upstairs, to the place she had never dared to venture as a child. With every step up the creaking stairs, it felt as though the house was coming more and more alive. The walls seemed to whisper, and she could almost hear the voices of those who had once lived here. Her hands slid along the railing, feeling the cold, smooth wood beneath her fingers. At the top, the hallway led to a row of doors. Most were locked, but one stood slightly ajar. Sophie instinctively knew she had to go in there. She pushed the door open further and stepped into the room. It was a children's bedroom, the furniture small and old-fashioned. But what truly made her freeze was the feeling that she had been here before, many years ago. On a table in the corner lay a book, covered in a layer of dust. Sophie slowly approached it, her heart pounding faster. She brushed off the dust and recognized the book as an old diary. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The writing was old, almost faded, but the words were clear enough to read. "It is no longer safe here," the first entry read. "The shadows come at night, and they whisper my name." Sophie sat down on the old chair and began to read the diary. It belonged to a girl named Clara, who had lived in the house many years ago. The entries were eerie, a mix of everyday events and dark hints of something terrible lurking in the house. Clara wrote about shadows roaming the house at night, doors opening by themselves, and a strange, barely perceptible whisper that threatened to drive her insane. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the words were directed at her, as if Clara was trying to tell her something. "I don't know how long I will be safe here," one of the last entries read. "I have tried to warn others, but they don't listen to me. They say I'm imagining things, but I know it's real. Something is here in the house. Something evil." Sophie closed the diary and looked around the room. The thought that Clara might have never escaped the house sent a shiver down her spine. She knew she had to continue searching for answers. Somewhere in this house lay the truth, and she would find it. As she left the room, she noticed the atmosphere in the house had changed. The shadows seemed denser, the whispering louder. It was as if the house itself was turning against her, trying to prevent her from uncovering the secrets hidden within. Sophie walked cautiously down the hallway, her steps careful and quiet. She felt the darkness closing in around her, thicker and more oppressive than before. Suddenly, she came across a door she hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than the others, almost hidden behind heavy wallpaper. Without hesitation, Sophie turned the handle. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a narrow, dark corridor. An unpleasant odor wafted toward her, a mix of decay and damp wood. Sophie hesitated, but then forced herself to move forward. She knew this was the only way to uncover the truth. The corridor led her deeper into the house to a room almost completely shrouded in darkness. The air was cold and heavy, and Sophie could see her own breath. In the middle of the room stood an old, decaying wardrobe. Something about this wardrobe made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Sophie approached, her hand trembling as she opened the wardrobe door. Inside, she found another diary, much older than Clara's. The pages were brittle and stained, but the writing was still legible. It told the story of another family that had lived in the house long ago. The entries described strange occurrences that closely resembled what Clara had experienced. But what frightened Sophie the most was the final entry. It was written in hurried, almost illegible letters. "We made a mistake. We should never have entered the house. It wants us. It will never let us go. If you are reading this, run. Run as fast as you can, and never come back." Sophie felt her heart race. She had the sense that the walls around her were closing in, that the darkness was about to engulf her. She had to get out before it was too late. Sophie stumbled back into the hallway, fear driving her forward. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, but a sense that the answer to the house's mystery had to be in a hidden room she had so far ignored wouldn't leave her. She remembered Clara's diary and the dark corner of the house she had neglected. With trembling hands, Sophie took the old key she had found in the wardrobe. It was a small, rusty key that seemed to indicate a hidden room. She took it and returned to the hallway, searching for a door that might have been locked for years. At the end of the hallway, she found a half-hidden door she had overlooked before. Her hand shook as she inserted the key into the lock. With a groan, the door opened, and Sophie stepped into the room beyond. The room was small, cramped, and filled with dust. Faded pictures and eerie masks hung on the walls, staring down at her. In the center of the room stood an old book, not dirty and dusty like the other books in the house. It was wrapped in a red cloth, which Sophie carefully pulled aside. The book was bound and looked as though it hadn't been opened for centuries. She opened it and found a handwritten account of events that confirmed the eerie occurrences in the house. The book was a record of the house's origins and the dark rituals performed by its former inhabitants. "The house is a prison," the first entry read. "It feeds on the fears and pain of those who enter. Once you enter, you will never escape." Sophie continued reading and learned that the house had been built by a secret order dedicated to the study of dark arts. The inhabitants had performed rituals to consolidate their power, but the final ritual had gone horribly wrong. Instead of gaining power, they had cursed the house, making it a place where the souls of those who discovered its darkness were trapped. The book also contained hints on how to break the curse. There was a passage about a hidden chamber in the cellar where an artifact was kept that had the power to end the curse. The thought that there might be a way out of this nightmare gave Sophie renewed courage. With the book in hand, Sophie set out to reach the house's cellar. The darkness in the cellar was even thicker than what she had already experienced. The stairs were steep, and the steps creaked under her weight. She descended cautiously, her heart pounding in her ears. The cellar was large, filled with boxes and old furniture covered in cobwebs and dust. It was hard to see anything, but Sophie searched for signs of a hidden chamber. The description in the book was vague, but she knew she had to find something. After a while, she discovered a peculiar pattern in the floor that looked like a trapdoor. She pressed carefully on the spots mentioned in the book and heard a faint click. A section of the floor moved, revealing a hidden staircase leading further into the darkness. Sophie did not hesitate. She took a flashlight from her bag and descended the stairs. The cellar space was small and dimly lit, with an old-fashioned desk in the center. On the desk lay a strangely shaped artifact that looked like an ornate amulet, embedded in an old velvet cloth. Sophie reached for the artifact, and as her hand touched the amulet, she felt an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The walls seemed to relax, and the whispering that had accompanied her the whole time grew quieter. It was as if the amulet had connected to the house's dark forces, drawing the darkness away. As Sophie picked up the amulet from the table, the room around her began to change. The walls undulated like water, and the darkness she had felt since her arrival seemed to retreat. The cellar, once so oppressive, suddenly appeared clearer, and the sense of threat began to diminish. But as she continued to examine the amulet, she realized it was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was covered in strange symbols and markings that glowed in the dark. Sophie had the feeling that the artifact was more than just an object. It was the key to understanding what the house truly was. She walked back to the main hall, the amulet firmly in her hand. The atmosphere in the house seemed to have changed. The eerie shadows were fewer, and the whispering had faded to a soft murmur. Sophie knew she had one last thing to do before she could finally leave the house. As Sophie walked down the hall, she felt the darkness closing in again. The voices grew louder, and the walls seemed to close in on her. She knew the house would do everything it could to prevent her from escaping. She reached the grand entrance hall, where she saw the figure she had seen in the window earlier, Clara. She stood in the middle of the room, her eyes empty and expressionless. Sophie couldn't tell if Clara was a vision or a real ghost, but she knew she had to confront her fears to defeat the house. Clara began to speak, her voice hollow and tormented. "You are not welcome here," she said. "The curse will never let you go." Sophie raised the amulet high, which glowed in her hand. "I will break the curse," she declared resolutely. "I will stop this house from trapping any more souls." The amulet began to shine more brightly, and the darkness around her seemed to retreat. Clara's form started to disintegrate, as if the power of the amulet was affecting her. The walls of the house trembled, and Sophie could feel a sense of liberation. With a final loud crash, the walls and the darkness shattered, and the house began to dissolve. Sophie watched as the dark shadows holding the house captive turned into light and dissolved into the air. When the darkness had finally disappeared, Sophie found herself outside the house, which now looked like an ordinary, dilapidated building. The eerie aura was gone, and the air was clear and fresh. The amulet she still held in her hand was now just an ordinary old piece of jewelry. Sophie took a deep breath and looked at the house. It was no longer the same malevolent entity that had held her captive for so long. She knew she had uncovered the house's secret and broken the curse. With one last glance at the old building, Sophie turned and walked back to the city. The memories of the grim night would always stay with her. But she knew she had found the courage and determination to face her fears and overcome the unspeakable. As she reached the city limits, she felt liberated, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The path ahead was now clear, and she knew she would carry forward the story of the house, the souls, and the curse, so that no one else would have to descend into the darkness she had experienced. Silent screams. The silence in the remote psychiatric hospital was almost oppressive. Hidden deep in the woods, far from civilization, it was the last refuge for people whose conditions were deemed too complex or too dangerous for general medical care. The hospital director, Dr. Roland Klein, was known for his unconventional methods and willingness to take on the most challenging cases. One rainy morning, a new patient arrived. Alex Roth, a man in his mid-30s who came to the hospital with an unusual and disturbing claim. Alex claimed he could hear the screams of the dead. The doctors and staff were skeptical, but Dr. Klein decided to admit him and give him a chance. Alex was placed in a single room designed for his safety and isolation. He was calm, almost too calm, for someone allegedly plagued by so many screams. But soon, the first unusual occurrences began to upend the quiet life in the hospital. In the first week after Alex's arrival, several staff members reported strange noises in the hospital. Initially, they were faint, almost imperceptible whispers, but they quickly grew louder and clearer. Some of the nurses and caregivers, including Emma and David, heard the screams at night in the empty corridors and initially thought it was their imagination. But soon, they realized the screams were real, and they came from throughout the building. Klein was initially skeptical and conducted investigations, but found no physical explanations for the sounds. The screams grew more intense from night to night, and the staff could hardly sleep. The condition of the hospital deteriorated rapidly, and the patients, already suffering from severe mental illnesses, began to hear the screams as well. One evening, when the screams were particularly loud, Dr. Klein visited Alex's room to talk to him. Alex was sitting on the floor, hands over his ears, as if trying to protect himself from the screams. He looked up as Dr. Klein entered, his eyes filled with fear. "They are angry," Alex said with a trembling voice. "They are angry because I didn't want to hear them. They want to be heard, and they want revenge." Dr. Klein was astonished by the precision of the statement. "What do you mean by revenge?" he asked. Alex spoke of a recurring dream where he was in an old, decaying building surrounded by countless tormented souls. The screams he heard were the voices of these souls trying to reach him. It turned out that Alex had been a medium as a child, unintentionally opening a connection to the spirit world. In the past, he had the ability to communicate with the dead, but had suppressed this gift to protect his sanity. The screams soon reached a climax, and the situation in the hospital became increasingly chaotic. The staff and patients were extremely frightened. Emma, one of the nurses, was driven to madness by a particularly loud scream and had to be taken to another hospital by Dr. Klein. Desperate to resolve the issue, Dr. Klein sought ways to break the curse or the connection Alex had unintentionally made. He tried hypnosis, ancient rituals, and various spiritual techniques, but nothing seemed to work. The screams grew louder, and the walls of the hospital began to change, as if they were under the influence of the spirits themselves. In a desperate attempt to stop the screams, Dr. Klein organized a final session with Alex. He hoped that Alex, who was now in a deteriorating state, might somehow help sever the connection to the spirits. Alex, who was almost completely broken, agreed. In a dark room illuminated by candlelight, they began a sort of spiritual ritual to calm the spirits. Alex spoke words from the spirit world meant to soothe him, while Dr. Klein and a few other staff members tried to support him. But the ritual ended in disaster. The screams intensified, the walls of the room began to bleed, and the hospital was hit by a massive storm of darkness and cold. The spirits seemed angrier than ever, and the connection Alex had opened grew even stronger. The events continued to escalate, and the hospital was eventually evacuated. Dr. Klein and the remaining staff could no longer stay. Alex was taken to a secure location where he remained under strict observation. The hospital was sealed and left untouched. The screams never stopped, but shifted to the vicinity of the hospital, into the surrounding forest. The town, previously untouched by the eerie events, began to be haunted by mysterious screams. People reported strange supernatural phenomena occurring near the decaying building. Dr. Klein, left with a deep sense of failure and guilt, devoted himself to studying the paranormal phenomenon to understand what had happened at the hospital. The screams had somewhat diminished, but the dark presence remained palpable. Years later, the hospital became a legend. Stories of the screams and the ghosts were passed down by locals, and the building remained a place of horror. The screams continued to echo through the forest, and people told tales of the place as if it were a living entity waiting for its next visitor. Alex Roth disappeared from public view, and no one knew exactly what became of him. The last word about him was that he was still trying to soothe the screams of the dead, possibly as a price for opening a door that should never have been opened. The hospital stood empty and silent, yet the screams did not cease. The darkness Alex had unintentionally unleashed remained in the world, an eternal echo from a place that would never truly find peace. The Puppeteer. In the small, idyllic town of Ravenswood, a series of children had mysteriously disappeared over the past few months. There were no traces, no clues, just a shocking void in the lives of the affected families. The town was marked by grief and confusion, and the police were at a loss. The only connection investigators could find was the old puppeteer, Elias Marlowe. He was a reclusive man who lived in a secluded workshop on the edge of town. Marlowe was known for his exquisite, handcrafted dolls, which bore an almost eerie resemblance to the missing children. The parents of the missing children reported that the dolls appeared unsettling, but they had no proof that the puppeteer was involved in any way. As the number of missing children continued to rise, Marlowe increasingly became a suspect. One night, young detective Nathaniel Blake decided to investigate the puppeteer's workshop. Blake was a dedicated investigator with a particular interest in missing children cases. As he entered the dusty, gloomy workshop, he was overcome by an eerie feeling. The workshop was filled with dolls, each one detailed and lifelike. Yet something about them was off. They seemed almost human, their eyes seeming to follow Nathaniel. On a table lay a doll that bore a frightening resemblance to one of the missing children. The details were so precise that Nathaniel felt a shiver down his spine. He continued to search the workshop and discovered old manuscripts and strange items in a hidden cupboard that appeared to be remnants of rituals. An old, tattered contract lay on a table, written in an incomprehensible ancient language. Nathaniel couldn't immediately grasp its meaning, but it was clear that the contract involved a dark pact. With the help of a historian and a supernatural expert, Nathaniel managed to decipher the contract. It turned out that the puppeteer had made a pact with a demon. The contract contained an agreement that the demon would extend Marlowe's life as long as he trapped the souls of children in his dolls. The demon had taken residence in the dolls, using them as vessels to capture the children's souls. Marlowe, once an honest craftsman, had been corrupted by the pact and could no longer escape it. The dolls were not just toys, but prisons for the children's souls. Nathaniel knew he had to act quickly to save the children. He began gathering evidence and informing the town about the true reason for the missing children. Most people thought his story was fantasy, but some began to believe in the detective and helped him with his investigation. With a small team of trusted individuals, Nathaniel devised a plan to confront Marlowe and defeat the demon. They needed to break into the workshop and destroy the dolls to free the children's souls. The contract, now fully understood, could serve as a key to their liberation. On a stormy night, Nathaniel and his team sneaked up to the puppeteer's workshop. The rain pounded the streets as they approached the ominous building. The puppeteer was not easy to find, as he was hiding in his lair during the confrontation. However, Nathaniel knew the demon might be lurking. As they entered the workshop, they were greeted by the dolls that seemed alive. Nathaniel and his team fought their way through the eerie dolls filled with the souls of the children. The puppeteer eventually emerged from the shadows, his eyes glowing with madness and despair. "It's too late," Marlowe shouted. "The pact is made. The souls are already trapped." Nathaniel tried to overpower him, but Marlowe was possessed by an eerie power. With the help of his partners and the old contract, Nathaniel managed to bind Marlowe in a ritual that weakened the demon's power. The battle against the demon was intense. The workshop was rocked by a supernatural storm, and the screams of the trapped souls echoed through the room. Nathaniel and his team desperately worked to destroy the dolls and free the souls. With one final, determined blow, Nathaniel destroyed the last doll containing the soul of the last missing child. The demon roared with fury and eventually vanished as the pact was broken. The children trapped in the dolls were freed. The souls returned to the world, and the town breathed a sigh of relief. The police were able to return the missing children, and the families were reunited. With the demon's end and the breaking of the pact, the eerie presence disappeared from the workshop. Elias Marlowe was arrested and spent the rest of his life in custody as a warning against the dark forces he had engaged with. Nathaniel Blake received recognition for his work, but the horrors he had experienced in the workshop would haunt him forever. The dolls were destroyed, and the workshop was condemned as a place of terror. Ravenswood slowly recovered from the eerie events, but the memory of the missing children and the dark powers that had held them captive would never entirely fade. Years later, when Nathaniel visited the town, he took one last look at the abandoned workshop. The place had become a symbol of the supernatural and was regularly visited by curious tourists and investigative journalists. Yet the workshop remained empty, and deserted, a relic of a dark past. Nathaniel knew that the dark history of Ravenswood would always linger in people's memories. The puppeteer was defeated, and the children were saved, but the ghosts of the past and the lessons from that dark time would forever remain. Under the bed, little Max had been plagued by nightmares for weeks. Every night he would wake up screaming, his heart pounding, and he could hardly breathe. In his dreams, he saw a terrifying monster lurking under his bed. It had large, claw-like hands that reached out from the darkness, trying to grab him. Max's parents, Karen and Michael, were worried but thought the nightmares were just a phase that would soon pass. They tried to reassure him, telling him that it was just his imagination and there was nothing to fear under his bed. But Max couldn't shake the constant iron grip of fear. He refused to sleep alone and begged his parents each night to leave the hallway light on. One night, when Max was particularly frightened, he woke his father Michael to tell him about the monster. Michael, exhausted from a long day at work, tried to calm his son's fears. "There are no monsters, Max," he said patiently, "but I'll check under the bed." Michael knelt in front of Max's bed and peered under it. The darkness was deep and impenetrable, and there seemed to be nothing but dust and old toys lying there. He laughed to reassure his son and said, "See, there's nothing there." As he stood up to leave, a massive claw suddenly reached out from the darkness under the bed and grabbed Michael by the wrist. A horrific scream echoed through the house as Michael desperately tried to free himself. Karen rushed into the room and saw Michael struggling against the claw with all his might. Eventually, the monster released him and retreated. The next morning, Michael was badly injured, and the family was in shock. The claw had left deep scratches on Michael's skin, and the injuries were healing slowly. Michael and Karen decided to uncover the cause of the strange events. Together, they went down to the basement, which provided access to the foundation of the house. In the basement, they found a hidden entrance to a network of tunnels. The tunnels were narrow, dirty, and seemed like a hiding place. The walls were filled with scratching and scurrying noises that made the family shiver. Cobwebs hung on the walls, resembling the threads of a monstrous spider's web. They discovered small footprints in the dust leading into the tunnels, which then suddenly vanished. Karen and Michael decided to explore the tunnels to find the monster. They took flashlights and tools to navigate the tight corridors. The deeper they went, the creepier the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to move as if they were alive, and the echo of their footsteps sounded like the cries of lost souls. Suddenly, they were surrounded by a group of monsters, grotesque creatures with glowing eyes and long claws. These beings lived in the shadows of the tunnels and were on the hunt for their next prey. The family had to face the terrifying onslaught as the monsters closed in. In a desperate attempt to survive, Karen and Michael fought against the monsters. They tried to fend off their attackers with whatever they could find: sticks, tools, and eventually fire. The monsters, however, were tough and relentless. The family found themselves in a fierce fight for survival as they tried to escape from the tunnels. With great effort, they managed to reach the exit of the tunnels and make their way to safety. The monsters seemed to be driven back by the flames, and the family returned to the house, where they sealed the entrances to the tunnels. The family knew they had to leave the house to be safe. They packed what they could and left the house, which was now considered cursed. Max, though still shaken, felt somewhat safer knowing that the monster could no longer lurk in the tunnels. Karen and Michael contacted specialists in supernatural phenomena and had the house thoroughly investigated. The experts confirmed that the house had been built on an old, eerie site that had long been influenced by dark forces. The house was abandoned and sealed forever. The family eventually found a new home and tried to rebuild their lives. Max still had occasional nightmares, but they became less intense over time. The memories of the monsters under the bed faded, but the horrors of the tunnels and the fight for survival left deep scars. Karen and Michael devoted themselves to supporting families who had experienced similar events and tried to use the knowledge they had gained to help others. The experience had shaped them, and they knew that the darkness under the bed would never completely disappear. It was merely hidden in the shadows, always ready to return. Years later, The family revisited the old house to ensure it remained secure. Despite the locked doors and windows, an eerie presence still seemed to linger nearby. The memories of the horrors under the bed remained vivid. The family's story became an urban legend in town. People spoke of the monsters lurking under the bed and the tunnels that ran through the house. The house remained empty and became a place where no one stayed longer than necessary. The family knew that the darkness they had faced would never fully disappear. It lived on in the stories and fears passed down from generation to generation. The silence of the deep. The research mission Neptune's Eye was an ambitious expedition to explore the deepest point of the Mariana Trench, a region of the Pacific that had remained unexplored for decades. The crew, consisting of marine biologists, engineers, and an experienced captain, set out with the new deep-sea submersible Orpheus to investigate the unknown depths of the ocean. After several days of fruitless searching, the crew discovered an old, abandoned submarine in the seemingly endless abyss. Its camouflage of algae and the decay of its outer structure made it an eerie sight. The initial excitement over the discovery soon gave way to concern, as they realized that the submarine had been reported missing decades ago and had not sent any contact signals since. The crew decided to investigate the submarine to learn more about the circumstances of its disappearance. Using the submersible's manipulator arm, they managed to open one of the submarine's access hatches. A chilling shiver ran down the researchers' spines as they entered the abandoned vessel. The state of the submarine was disturbing. Everything was covered in a thick layer of rust and grime, and the air was stale and heavy. The interior was eerily silent. The crew discovered that all electronic devices were offline, and the entire control center was engulfed in chaos with tangled cables and broken instruments. Yet amidst the destruction, they found strange symbols and markings scratched into the walls, symbols they couldn't decipher and that seemed to belong to a long-forgotten culture. As the crew ventured deeper into the submarine, an unsettling sense of discomfort began to permeate the atmosphere. The submarine's sounds became increasingly strange and eerie, a deep, pulsating hum that could not be traced to the machinery. Crew members reported a sudden chill that swept through the ship and faint whispering voices they could barely hear. The captain, an experienced sailor, tried to calm the situation, but the feeling of doom only intensified. Equipment began to fail inexplicably, and the atmosphere inside the submarine grew increasingly oppressive. As they moved further, they found the room where the original crew member had likely disappeared. Old, decayed uniforms and personal items of the crew were still there. Gradually, the crew members began to sense a malevolent presence. The submarine's lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the narrow corridors. It became clear that they were not alone. The ancient presence that had accompanied the submarine through the depths of the ocean had taken control of the ship and awaited new victims. One team member, Dr. Emily Carter, a psychologist who studied paranormal phenomena, recognized the signs of a supernatural force. She explained to the crew that they might be dealing with an entity capable of driving people insane by exploiting their fears and nightmares. The situation quickly escalated. The presence in the submarine began to actively attack the crew. The noises turned into loud, piercing screams, and the visions became more intense and frightening. Crew members saw terrifying apparitions and were attacked by invisible forces. The emergency systems designed for such situations failed, and the crew lost control of the submarine. The presence seemed to cling directly to the heart of the vessel, thwarting all attempts to escape. The captain and crew desperately tried to regain control of the submarine, but the situation grew increasingly hopeless. With the submarine sinking ever deeper into the ocean and control over the system slipping away, the remaining crew members faced a desperate struggle. They tried to resist the presence by attacking the entity with the remaining equipment and examining the symbols they had found. Dr. Carter realized that the symbols might represent a kind of protective circle that could potentially hold back the evil. Using the few resources left, they attempted to replicate these symbols in various parts of the submarine to weaken the presence. In a desperate attempt to escape the submarine, some survivors managed to send out an emergency signal and get into a small lifeboat that had been provided as a backup on the Orpheus. As they neared the exit, the submarine was inexplicably drawn together by dark forces and disintegrated in the deep waters of the Mariana Trench. The survivors, completely exhausted and traumatized, were rescued by the Orpheus. The journey back to the surface was marked by silence and exhaustion. They reported the events that had occurred aboard the submarine and tried to process the eerie experiences. After their return, the submarine and its ominous secrets were sealed off permanently. The documents and records were kept under strict lock and key. The Neptune's Eye project was canceled, and the discovery of the submarine was dismissed as a tragic event. The survivors tried to rebuild their lives, but the experiences under the sea continued to haunt them. The darkness of the deep sea and the presence they had encountered remained an indelible part of their memories. The depths of the ocean still held secrets that were better left in the dark. The story of the Silence of the Deep became an urban legend whispered among the residents of the coastal town, a reminder of the horrors of the unexplored depths of the sea. The Eternal Sleep. David, a successful businessman, leads an apparently normal life until he is suddenly plagued by insomnia. His nights are filled with tormenting nightmares that are so vivid he can barely distinguish them from reality. At first, he thinks it's just a temporary issue, but the nights increasingly become riddled with terror and panic. He tries various therapies and medications, but nothing seems to help. The nightmares are always the same. David finds himself in a dark, distorted reflection of his own world. The streets are warped, the buildings seem to grow into the sky, and the light is infused with an eerie, dull glow. People in his dreams behave oddly and speak in riddles he cannot decipher. One night, after a particularly terrifying episode where he is chased by shadows, David awakens in his own apartment. Yet, something is not quite right. The furniture appears to be in the wrong places, and the walls breathe like living beings. Everything looks familiar, but is fundamentally altered. As he leaves the house, he notices that the streets are endless and the landscapes distorted. The people he encounters seem indifferent or angry, and their words are full of dark prophecies and warnings. David begins to realize that he is no longer in the real world. David desperately tries to find a way out of this world that keeps slipping away from him. He discovers that every wish or decision he makes has unexpected and frightening consequences. When he craves food, grotesque, inedible things appear before him. When he seeks safety, he is only led deeper into a maze of threatening shadows and hallucinations. Time seems to dissolve in this world. Minutes stretch into hours, and hours into days. David feels trapped in an endless cycle with no escape. He encounters other people in similar despair who tell him they have been trapped in this nightmare for eternity. David finds an ancient book in an abandoned library that explains the nature of this world. He learns that it is a kind of dream realm created by an unknown, all-powerful entity. This world reflects the deepest fears and desires of the people drawn into it, and the laws of reality no longer apply. He realizes that his previous nightmares were merely forerunners to this eternal imprisonment. The entity that controls this world has ensnared him in this nightmare because his fears and desires made him vulnerable. David decides to fight the entity to regain his freedom. He searches for a way to alter or influence the world by breaking the rules that keep him captive. But the entity seems to anticipate every move he makes, driving him deeper into despair. He is tormented by hallucinations that make him believe there is no escape. The world around him becomes increasingly hostile, and the horrors become ever more grotesque. He understands that he is fighting a force far beyond his comprehension. After countless failed attempts and the loss of all hope, David gives up. He accepts that he will never wake up again and that he is forever trapped in this cruel, dreamlike hell. The world around him becomes a grotesque reflection of his own psyche, and he slowly loses his identity and sanity. In a final act of defiance, David decides to seek his own death in the dream world, hoping it might bring him ultimate peace. But even this last attempt brings him no relief, only plunges him deeper into the darkness of the entity. David awakens one day in the same cruel world from which there is no escape. Everything around him remains unchanged, and the entity has left him to continue his torment. The constant threat of the distorted reality and the relentless nightmares remain his only reality. The nightmare that began in his nightly visions has now become his eternal state. David has lost the realization that there was ever another reality. He is forever trapped in the world he once saw, only in his worst nightmares. The story of David is told by the few who have learned of this dream world as a cautionary legend. It is a reminder that the deepest fears and desires of a person can lead them into a hell from which there is no escape. The realm of eternal sleep remains an unexplored and eerie place, waiting for others to fall into its cruel grasp.